The tomb was not silent. That is the first thing most people get wrong. When we imagine the hours and days following the crucifixion of Jesus of Nazareth, we tend to picture a kind of frozen stillness, stone walls, cold air, a wrapped body resting undisturbed while the world waited in holy suspension. We imagine something cinematic, reverent, and removed from the noise of ordinary life. But the world outside that tomb was not pausing. It was churning. It was loud with fear. And inside the city of Jerusalem, something was happening that no one who had followed Jesus was prepared to face. What actually took place during those 3 days? What were the people doing? The disciples? The women? The Roman soldiers? The priests? What did grief look like in a first-century Jewish city during a major religious festival? And why do those specific hours, between late Friday afternoon and early Sunday morning, contain details so deeply embedded in the culture of ancient Judea that most modern readers simply pass over them without understanding what they mean? Stay until the end, because understanding this changes how we read the Gospels. And it changes something in us too. To begin, you have to understand what kind of city Jerusalem was in the days leading up to Passover. It was not a quiet, orderly town. In the weeks before the feast, the population of the city could swell from perhaps 80,000 permanent residents to somewhere between 200,000 and 500,000 pilgrims who had traveled, some from hundreds of miles away, to fulfill the commandment to appear before God at the temple. They came from Egypt, from Babylon, from Rome, from Persia. They came speaking different dialects of Aramaic, Greek, Hebrew, and languages that most Judeans had never heard. The roads into the city were clogged with families carrying lambs, with merchants hawking birds and oil and incense, with money changers setting up their tables near the outer courts. The smell of the city was overwhelming. Animals, unwashed bodies, smoke from the sacrificial altar drifting westward over the limestone rooftops, the heavy perfume of myrrh and cedar oil used in burial preparations, the yeasty warmth of bread being baked in clay ovens before the feast required all leavened dough to be cleared from every household. This is the world into which Jesus had entered just days earlier on a donkey, welcomed by crowds waving palm branches. And this is the world that, by late Friday afternoon, had watched him die on a Roman cross outside the city walls. If you are watching this and something in this story has ever felt distant or abstract, we invite you to stay close, because this channel exists precisely to bring you back into the world where these events actually happened. Subscribe if you want to keep walking through that world together. Now, the moment of death on a Roman cross was not, by itself, the end of a family's ordeal. In Jewish law and custom, the body of the dead had to be treated with extraordinary care. The concept of kavod ha-met, the honor owed to the dead, was not a vague sentiment. It was a legal and moral framework that governed exactly how a corpse must be handled, how quickly it must be buried, and who bore the responsibility for ensuring that it was done correctly. A body left unburied was a profound shame, not only for the dead, but for every living relative. In the book of Deuteronomy, the Torah commands explicitly that even the body of a man executed for a capital crime must not be left hanging overnight. It must be taken down and buried before the sun sets. This was not a suggestion, it was a commandment. And here was the problem that Saturday, the Sabbath, the holiest day of the week, began at sundown on Friday. The moment the first 3 stars appeared in the sky, all work ceased. No tools could be used, no fires could be lit, no long journeys could be made, and a body could not be anointed, wrapped, or prepared for burial with the full ritual care that Jewish custom required. There was barely time on Friday afternoon to get the body down from the cross, move it to a nearby tomb, and seal the entrance, which is precisely what Joseph of Arimathea did hurriedly as the sun dropped toward the horizon. This is a detail that modern readers often gloss over. But for the women who had been present at the crucifixion, Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, Salome, it was not a minor inconvenience. It was a source of acute distress. They had watched the man they followed and loved die in one of the most brutal forms of public execution the ancient world had ever devised. They had watched his body removed from the cross and placed in a borrowed tomb. And now the Sabbath was beginning, which meant they could not go to him. They could not complete the burial rites. They could not anoint his body with the spice-laden oils and aromatic resins that Jewish practice demanded. They had to wait. That waiting, those hours between Friday evening and Sunday morning, is where the real story lives. Because what were they waiting for? In their minds, in the minds of every person who had believed that this man was the fulfillment of Israel's ancient hopes, the crucifixion was not a chapter in a story of victory. It was the end of the story entirely. Crucifixion was Rome's way of making a statement that was impossible to misread. This man was a criminal, a subversive, a threat to the order of the empire, and he has been destroyed publicly and completely. The cross was not only an instrument of death, it was an instrument of humiliation, of erasure. Rome crucified people outside city walls, along roadsides, precisely so that the maximum number of people would see the body, understand the message, and feel the weight of imperial power press down on any thought of resistance. And so in the hours after the sun set on Friday, scattered across Jerusalem in upper rooms and borrowed courtyards, the people who had followed Jesus of Nazareth were not waiting in quiet hope. They were hiding. They were grieving. They were trying to understand how everything they had believed could have collapsed so completely, so publicly, so finally. The stone at the entrance to the tomb felt, to them, like the last word in a sentence that Rome had written. They did not yet know it was only a comma. The Sabbath in Jerusalem was not merely a rest. It was a wall. From the moment the sun disappeared behind the western hills on Friday evening, the city changed. The noise that had defined Jerusalem during the festival week, the haggling, the movement of animals, the shouting of pilgrims navigating crowded alleys, fell away into something that was not exactly peace. It was closer to suspension. The markets sealed their stalls. The gates of private courtyards were drawn shut. Families gathered inside their homes around oil lamps that had been lit before nightfall, because no new fire could be kindled once the Sabbath had begun. The smell of roasting lamb and unleavened bread filled the narrow streets, and then gradually dissipated as households settled into the evening meal, into prayer, into the rhythms of a day that Jewish life had organized itself around for centuries. For most of Jerusalem, this Sabbath was also Passover. It was the holiest convergence of the Jewish calendar, the weekly day of rest landing on the very feast that commemorated the night God had passed over the homes of Israel in Egypt and led an enslaved people out of bondage. There were prayers to recite, specific foods to eat in a specific order, psalms to sing that every Jewish child had memorized before they could read. The Hallel Psalms, Psalms 113 through 118, were sung at the Passover table, and their words rang through stone walls and into the streets. Give thanks to the Lord, for he is good. His love endures forever. Somewhere in the city, in a room that the Gospel of John describes only as locked, the disciples of Jesus sat behind a closed door. The text says they were hiding for fear of the Jewish authorities. That detail is precise and important. They were not simply mourning. They were afraid for their own lives. Associating publicly with a man whom Rome had just executed as a criminal and insurrectionist was not a neutral act. It was dangerous. The authorities who had pressed for Jesus' crucifixion were still present, still powerful, still watching. And the disciples, most of them Galileans, men who had left fishing boats and tax tables to follow a teacher from Nazareth, had no political protection, no wealth, no institutional backing of any kind. They were exposed. The man who had been the center of everything they had reorganized their lives around was dead, sealed in a rock-cut tomb on the edge of the city. And every reason they had given their families and neighbors for following him had just been publicly and brutally invalidated. Consider what that felt like inside a body, not as theology, but as physical experience. The exhaustion of a week of emotional intensity, the specific shock of watching a violent death up close, the sounds of it, the smell of blood in the afternoon heat, the particular horror of crucifixion, which was designed not only to kill but to take as long as possible doing it. Then the compressed, frantic rush of getting the body down before sundown, the weight of it, the linen wrappings applied hastily in the fading light, the stone rolled across the entrance with the dull grinding sound of limestone against limestone, and then the silence, and then the Sabbath beginning, sealing everything into stillness, locking them inside both the room and the grief. The women experienced this differently. The Gospels are careful to note that while the male disciples scattered, Peter had already denied Jesus 3 times before a servant girl in the courtyard of the high priest. The women remained. They stood at a distance watching the crucifixion. They followed the body to the tomb. They noted exactly where it was laid and how the entrance was sealed. And when the Sabbath ended at Saturday nightfall, they did not wait until morning. They prepared. They went to purchase spices and aromatic oils, myrrh, aloes, the blended resins used in Jewish burial preparation. And they made ready to go to the tomb at first light on the first day of the week, while it was still dark, to finish what had been interrupted by the setting sun on Friday. This act of preparation is not a footnote. It is the moral and emotional center of the resurrection story. Because what the women were doing, in purchasing those burial spices and planning to return to the tomb, was an act of love that carried within it absolutely no expectation of anything other than a sealed rock, a wrapped corpse, and the slow work of grief. They were not going to witness a miracle. They were going to anoint a body. They were going to do the thing that love requires, even when there is nothing left to hope for. To show up, to touch, to honor, to weep without shame. And there is something else happening in the city during this Sabbath that the Gospels mention almost in passing, but which turns out to be extraordinarily revealing. Matthew records that the chief priests and Pharisees went to Pilate on the Sabbath, an act that itself tells you something about how seriously they took the situation, and asked him to secure the tomb. Their argument was specific. They remembered that Jesus had said he would rise after 3 days, and they were afraid his disciples would come, steal the body, and then claim that the resurrection had occurred. Pilate's response was characteristically dismissive and bureaucratic. "You have a guard. Go. Make it as secure as you can." Think carefully about what this moment reveals. The religious authorities who had spent weeks plotting to arrest Jesus, who had organized his trial in the middle of the night, who had applied pressure on Pilate to override his own hesitation and authorize an execution. These men were still afraid of him. Not of the man anymore, of the idea, of the story that might survive the body. Because they understood, in a way that the devastated disciples apparently could not yet grasp, that the power of what Jesus had said and done was not necessarily extinguished by his death. Ideas could outlive crosses, stories could outlive tombs, and if a story began to circulate that this man had returned, that the execution had failed in some final, cosmic sense, there would be no containing it. So they posted guards at the entrance to the tomb, Roman soldiers or temple police, standing watch over a sealed rock in the pre-dawn darkness of a Passover Sabbath, a sign to prevent a dead man from becoming a symbol. The irony is almost too large to hold, because outside the city walls, in that carved chamber of limestone and shadow, something was either happening or about to happen. Something that no seal and no guard and no amount of institutional power could have anticipated or contained. The darkness before Sunday morning was not empty. It was the last moment before everything changed. And the women were already awake, grinding spices in the lamplight, wrapping their grief into small clay jars, preparing to walk toward a tomb they expected to find exactly as they had left it. The road to the tomb was not a road in the modern sense. It was a packed dirt path worn into the hillside west of the city walls, threading between rock-cut tombs and garden plots, lined on either side with the low scrub and limestone outcroppings that characterized the terrain just outside Jerusalem's gates. In the early hours before dawn, it would have been nearly lightless. The Passover moon was full or close to full. That was one of the astronomical requirements for the festival, which was always set on the 14th of Nisan, when the lunar cycle was at or near its peak. And so there would have been some pale, diffuse light falling across the path. Enough to walk by, enough to see the shapes of the larger stones, but not enough to see clearly, not enough to feel safe, not enough to make the journey feel like anything other than what it was: women moving through darkness toward a place of death. Mary Magdalene is named in all four Gospels as present at the tomb. The other women named vary slightly by account: Mary, the mother of James, Salome, Joanna. But the consistency of Mary Magdalene across every version of the story is not accidental. She had been among the most devoted of Jesus' followers, a woman whom the Gospel of Luke describes as having been healed of a severe affliction, and who had subsequently supported Jesus' ministry out of her own means. She was not a marginal figure. She was someone who had reorganized her entire life around this teacher, and who had now watched him die, and had spent 2 days locked in the paralysis of grief and Sabbath restriction, while the body of the man she followed lay unattended in borrowed stone. What she and the other women were carrying that morning was not only spices. They were carrying the full weight of what burial preparation meant in the Jewish world of the 1st century. To anoint a body was to perform an act of chesed, of loving kindness that the dead person could never repay, and the living person performed purely out of love and obligation to human dignity. The spices used were expensive. Myrrh, in particular, was an import, carried overland through the Arabian trade routes, sold in the markets of Jerusalem at prices that put it beyond the reach of most ordinary families. Aloes, in the quantities described in John's account, represented a staggering investment. The fact that these women had gone to purchase these materials at the first possible moment after the Sabbath ended tells you exactly how seriously they took this obligation and how completely they expected to need them. They were not expecting an empty tomb. They were expecting a body. The question they discussed on the way, according to Mark's Gospel, was entirely practical. Who will roll away the stone for us from the entrance of the tomb? This detail is quietly devastating in its ordinariness. Here are women who have witnessed a crucifixion, who have spent 2 days in a state of shock and grief, who are walking before dawn to perform burial rites on the body of their teacher. And the thing they are talking about is the logistics, the stone. Because the tomb had been sealed with a large disk of shaped limestone rolled in a carved channel across the entrance, and it was too heavy for women to move alone. They needed help. They were already calculating whom they might find, what they might ask, whether there were other disciples nearby or gardeners who worked the area who might assist them. This is what grief looks like when it is functional rather than frozen. You keep moving. You plan the next step. You worry about the stone. And then they arrived, and the stone was already moved. The Gospel accounts diverge in certain details at this point. The number of angelic figures present, the exact words spoken, the order in which the various disciples arrived. But they converge completely on the essential fact. The tomb was open, and it was empty. The grave linens were there. The cloth that had been wrapped around Jesus' head was folded separately, lying in a different place from the other linens. And the body was gone. The response of the women, and then of Peter and the unnamed beloved disciple who ran to the tomb after Mary Magdalene reported what she had found, was not immediate faith. That is one of the most important and most frequently overlooked details in the entire resurrection narrative. The text does not describe people who arrived at an empty tomb and instantly understood what had happened and broke into joyful proclamation. It describes bewilderment, fear, a kind of stunned incomprehension. John says explicitly that they did not yet understand the scripture, that he must rise from the dead. They understood only that he was not there, which opened, rather than closed, a terrifying range of possibilities. Someone could have moved the body. The guards stationed at the entrance. Where were they now? Had something happened during the night that no one had witnessed? Had the authorities arranged for the body to be relocated to prevent it from becoming a site of pilgrimage or protest? In a city where political and religious tensions were this high, in the aftermath of an execution that had already drawn enormous public attention, the removal of a body from its tomb was not an inconceivable act. It was, in fact, almost plausible. Almost. Except for the linens. Grave robbers and tomb robbery was common enough in antiquity that Roman law prescribed severe penalties for it, did not unwrap bodies. They took valuables, rings, amulets, the coins sometimes placed on or near the dead, occasionally the burial cloth itself, if it was expensive enough to be worth taking. They did not leave the linens neatly arranged inside an otherwise empty tomb. The physical evidence inside that chamber was not consistent with theft. It was not consistent with any ordinary human action that anyone present that morning could have constructed a clear explanation for. Mary Magdalene, left alone at the tomb after Peter and the other disciple had gone back, stood outside and wept. And in the account that John preserves with extraordinary intimacy, she bent down and looked into the tomb again, and this time saw two figures seated where the body had been. And then she turned, and there was someone standing behind her in the early morning light, and she assumed he was the gardener. And she said to him, "Sir, if you have carried him away, tell me where you have put him, and I will get him." She was still trying to solve the logistics. She was still in the world of stone and spice jars and practical arrangements. She was still expecting, even now, to carry something back. And then he said her name. Just her name. One word. Mary. And in the saying of it, in the particular way he said it. The way only one person had ever said it to her. The entire framework of what she thought she knew about death and loss and the finality of sealed tombs, cracked open like limestone under impossible pressure. She turned, and she saw. There is a word in the Greek text of John's Gospel that most translations render simply as teacher. When Mary Magdalene turned and recognized the man standing before her in the garden, she said one word, Rabboni. It is not standard Greek. It is an Aramaic form of the word rabbi, but with an intensifier attached, a suffix that carries emotional weight, something closer to my own teacher or my dearest teacher than to the flat honorific that the plain English translation suggests. It is the word a student used for a teacher to whom they had given not just their intellectual attention, but their life. It is the word of someone who had reorganized everything: home, relationships, daily routine, public reputation, around the teachings of a specific person. And it is the word that came out of Mary Magdalene's mouth in the first moment of recognition, before she had time to think, before theology or doctrine or any kind of formal understanding had a chance to arrange itself into something coherent. It was the word of someone who had lost something irreplaceable and had just found it again. This moment, a woman alone in a garden at dawn, saying one word to a man she had believed was dead, is the hinge point on which the entire history of Christianity turns. Everything that follows in the story of the early church, every letter Paul wrote, every community that gathered in homes across the Roman Empire to break bread and pray and read these accounts aloud to one another, every subsequent century of belief and practice and argument and martyrdom, all of it traces back to this encounter in this garden, in this particular quality of early morning light, with this one word said by this one woman. And what the resurrection appearances that follow over the next 40 days reveal, systematically, almost methodically, is something that first-century Jewish understanding had no clear category for. The Jewish tradition held strong beliefs about resurrection, but they were beliefs about a general resurrection at the end of history, when all the dead would rise together at the final judgment. The idea of a single individual rising from the dead in the middle of history, ahead of everyone else, bodily and physically, and in a form that could be touched and could eat and could be recognized by his voice. This was not a concept that existed in the framework that Jesus' followers had inherited, which is precisely why, even after the empty tomb, even after Mary's report, even after Peter and John had seen the grave linens with their own eyes, the disciples were still hiding behind locked doors that evening. They had the evidence. They did not yet have the category. And then Jesus appeared in the locked room. And Thomas was not there, and he refused to believe the report of those who had seen. And a week later, Jesus appeared again, specifically for Thomas. And the response of Thomas, "My Lord and my God," is the most direct, unambiguous declaration of divine identity anywhere in the gospel narratives, spoken not by a theologian constructing a doctrine, but by a man who had spent a week in the specific anguish of being the one who had not seen, the one who had held out, the one who had demanded physical proof, and then been given it in a way that overwhelmed every defense he had constructed. What is striking about these post-resurrection appearances is how completely they resist the shape of a fabricated story. If the disciples had invented this narrative to preserve the movement after their leader's death, which is one of the oldest alternative explanations for the resurrection accounts, they did not invent it well. They did not present themselves favorably. They show up in these stories confused, frightened, disbelieving, hiding. The first witness to the resurrection is a woman. In a legal and cultural context where women's testimony was not considered fully valid in formal proceedings. The disciples on the road to Emmaus spend an entire journey talking to the risen Jesus without recognizing him. Peter, who has already denied Jesus 3 times and is carrying that failure inside him like a stone, has a private encounter at the lakeside in Galilee that the Gospel of John recounts with almost unbearable emotional precision. 3 questions, 3 affirmations, a direct echo of the 3 denials, a restoration that matches the shape of the wound. These are not the details that people inventing a triumphant story choose to include. And what connects all of these moments, the garden, the locked room, the road, the lakeshore, is the same texture that defined everything Jesus had ever said and done during his ministry. He found people in their specific, concrete, particular humanity. He met them in the middle of the actual thing they were carrying. Mary, weeping over logistics and a missing body. Thomas, hardened by a week of refusing to hope so he could not be hurt again. Peter, unable to look directly at his own failure. The two disciples on the road, explaining to a stranger the story of their shattered expectations. We had hoped that he was the one to redeem Israel. That phrase, "we had hoped," is one of the saddest phrases in any ancient text. It is the voice of a past tense that has swallowed everything. Jesus did not walk past any of them. He stopped. He asked what they were carrying. He said their names, or broke bread in a way only he broke it, or asked 3 times the question that needed to be asked 3 times. And in each case, the encounter was calibrated with impossible precision to the exact shape of that person's need. This is what the 3 days after the crucifixion ultimately reveal, not as theological abstraction, but as historical texture. The resurrection did not happen in a flash of triumphant light before an assembled crowd. It happened in a garden before dawn to a weeping woman. It happened in a locked room to a group of frightened men. It happened on a dusty road to 2 disciples who had already given up and were walking away. And it happened at a charcoal fire on a lakeshore to a fisherman who needed to be asked 3 times whether he loved the man he had denied 3 times, so that the architecture of his failure could be taken apart the same way it had been built. 1 moment, 1 question, 1 answer at a time. The stone at the entrance of the tomb was not rolled away to let Jesus out. Scholars and theologians have noted this for centuries. Whatever the nature of the resurrection body described in these accounts, a body that could walk through locked doors and yet be touched and could eat fish, it was not a body that needed a stone moved to exit a tomb. The stone was rolled away so that the people outside could see in, so that Mary could look into the empty space, so that Peter and John could enter and stand in the place where the body had been and see the evidence with their own eyes, and begin, slowly, the process of understanding something that had no precedent and would take the rest of their lives to articulate. The 3 days after Jesus died are not a waiting room between the crucifixion and the triumph. They are a complete story in themselves. A story about what human beings look like when everything they believed has been taken from them, and what it looks like when that same everything is handed back in a form more real and more permanent than anything they had originally understood it to be. The women who carried spice jars through the darkness did not need less faith because they brought burial ointment. They needed more. It takes a particular kind of love to keep moving toward a tomb with nothing left to hope for. And it is precisely that love, practical, grieving, logistical, stubbornly present, that was standing in the right place at the right moment to hear its own name spoken in the dark. That is where the resurrection found its first witness. Not in a throne room, not in the temple courts, in a garden at dawn, beside an empty tomb, in the voice of someone saying the name of someone who had never stopped looking for him.